Welcome, readers, scholars, autodidacts, and curious people. Today's recommended book for all feminists to read is Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth, Her Stories and Hymns from Sumer, jointly written by Diane Wolkstein and Samuel Noah Kramer. Every wannabe feminist should read this book because, as I've said in other videos, we must know our history to understand what influences us now and where we can go in the future. Few people know the real history of the Sumerian goddess Inanna, who often gets conflated with other goddesses such as Ishtar of Babylon, Astarte of Judaism, and even Athena of Greece. Sam Kramer, who was the Sumerian scholar Diane Wolkstein consulted in order to rewrite the hymns and stories about the goddess Inanna, still believed Inanna and Ishtar were one and the same goddess when he worked with Wolkstein in 1983. There are important distinctions between the two goddesses that few scholars have ever explored. All of these differences were caused by the rising androcentrism, or the belief that males are superior to females, that held Babylon and which still influences us today. But the Sumerian goddess Inanna, who undoubtedly was worshipped long before Sumerians began to write down her hymns, myths, and prayers, was probably the most powerful deity ever conceived of by human beings. Superior in many ways to the male gods who would eventually supplant her and take over many of the powers only Inanna controlled for the Ubaid and the early Sumerian people. Inanna controlled everything. What gender a person was, even having the power to change that gender long after a person was born. How sexuality manifested healing and transformations because of its magical elements. How critical thinking changed human fates. When city rulers and later kings were sanctified by the gods. What crops and animals would be fertile in order to reproduce themselves in future generations. How to overcome death, demonstrating it herself through her own journey to and from the underworld. What cities would prosper under which kings, and even when and how to go to war. Yet most Sumerian scholars view her as the androcentrists who rose to power in Sumeria wanted us to see her, as subordinate to the male gods, whom she calls father in many of the hymns and poems, in order to demonstrate her lower status and to show her in an obsequious or fawning role as a mere female god. Because of Kramer's belief that a woman's sexuality has to be controlled by someone other than the woman, his bias against the sexually trained priestesses from Inanna's Uruk temple, the Inanna, still echoes in Wolkstein's poems, when we see, for instance, the word prostitution instead of the art of sexual healing among the sacred May, listed on page 17. Remember, the Sumerian sacred May were the powers imbued by the gods on humanity through Inanna in a ceremony called the Kursu ritual, wherein her high priestess reenacted Inanna's seduction of the shepherd god Dumuzi during the city's annual spring festival. A successful Kursu ritual not only ensured that all the crops and flocks would flourish, but also that the gods sanctified the elected ruler's reign by imbuing him or her with the sacred May through sexual intercourse. Inanna's seductive powers are on full display in Wolkstein's version of the story of the courtship of Inanna and Dumuzi, even though the poem is cast in its much later version of being a seduction that leads to marriage. instead of the original seduction for the sake of great sex that the original poem implies. So, when you read the lines, Dumuzi's cream is good, his milk is good, and the shepherd went to the royal house with cream, and let the milk of the goat flow in my sheepfold. The poem is not discussing real milk or real cream. Realize that for the ancient Sumerians, semen was a form of milk meant to be fed to babies in the womb. So these lines are talking about Dumuzi's cum. The poem shows us Inanna's seductive technique so that when she calls her vulva the horn, the boat of heaven, she is inviting Dumuzi for a ride on her boat of heaven because, as the poem says, it is full of eagerness like the young moon. She extends the sexual metaphors by asking, "Who will plow my vulva?" repeatedly in the next few lines. When we read that at Dumuzi's lap stood the rising cedar, the poem is not talking about that kind of wood, but is clearly describing an erect penis, ready for penetration. The poem continues the metaphoric litany by having Inanna say, "My barley grows high in its furrow," referring to her attentive clitoris, when she exclaims that her uterus loves Dumuzi's sprout best. When Inanna is fully ready to copulate, she tells Dumuzi, "Make your milk sweet and thick." What is most challenging for scholars who have been raised in our androcentric or male-biased culture is viewing these graphic scenes from the real Sumerian cultural view, wherein sex is not something nasty that nice girls are not supposed to enjoy, but is divine, literally and figuratively. For the Ubaid and the Sumerians, indeed for most cultures around the world, pre-biological knowledge of conception, which did not happen until around 2400 before the Common Era, remember, sex was a liminal activity, which means experiencing it was like stepping over a threshold between the earth and the heavens. For the Sumerians, sexual sensations opened up doorways into connections with the divine, with the gods themselves. It was through training at Inanna's temple in Uruk that priestesses and priests learned to use hashadu, the form of sacred sex that could heal or transform, which they enacted in the temple to heal Inanna's followers. Such sexual healing was well known in other cultures too, from the Hindus to the Iroquois. Unfortunately, androcentrism has so heavily influenced Sumerian scholarship that few can read these blatantly sexual passages without forcing the activities into a marital vow of some sort, which is why most scholars mistakenly label this sexual activity heros gamos, or sacred marriage. This problem was especially keen for the Victorian scholars, who originally began interpreting the Sumerian cuneiform tablets that were discovered in vast numbers in the mid and late 1800s. Sex was not something spoken about then by people of polite society. Realize that I am a lifelong monogamist, having been married to my one and only husband for 34 years, so I'm not advocating for a swinging sexual lifestyle. What other adults do with other consenting adults is none of my personal business. However, even monogamous couples can experience the health benefits of good sex. My oldest sister, for instance, used to tell her husband that she needed her heart pill as a euphemism for wanting sex. What I'm advocating for is an elevated view of women and for the realization that women are powerful human beings who can help and who can heal others and can participate in sex in a healing way themselves. Women are not sex itself, even though when you Google sex, you usually get images of women. But women can and do enjoy sexual intercourse as much as men do. And as long as sex is between consenting adults with no harm being done to any participants, sex is not only normal, but also a healthy thing. While androcentrism developed into what we now call the patriarchy, the patriarchy's main goal has continued to be, over the last several millennia, to control women's bodies in order to control reproduction. However, no one has the right to tell any woman what she can or cannot do with her own body. So I hope you agree with me that the days of patriarchal control over women's bodies is over. In the same poem I have already been quoting from this book, it is important to note that Inanna originally did not want anything to do with Dumuzi, so steadfastly refused first her brother's and then her parents' suggestion that she accept the shepherd god's sexual advances. Inanna, a bit snobbily, asserts that Dumuzi's clothes are coarse, his wool is rough, explaining that she prefers everything the farmer has to offer instead, such as soft flax to make linen for her clothes. The poem, overall, demonstrates familial pressure for a woman to take up with a man. True, but it also is demonstrating that Inanna and human women like her can and should exercise their own choices. Perhaps Wolkstein's words can help me sum up the importance of having modern-day feminists read Inanna's hymns. In the telling, especially in the moments of repetition, such as the second or third time Inanna's story is told in the Hulupu tree, or during the 7 disrobings of the descent of Inanna, I too have felt the strange opening up quality of these stories. If I were falling out of the storyteller audience framework into a deeper, more eternal soul place. The ancient Sumerians, like so many of us, were constantly looking for the soul's connections to others, to the world, to the universe, and to the divine. Perhaps it is through this trance-like awe of such poetry and stories that we will find the connections we seek. Keep reading. Please like, subscribe, and share.